I'm pleased to introduce our dinner speaker tonight, Dr. Marie Chetta. Dr. Chetta is the president and chief scientist of the Huntington Medical Research Institutes, or HMRI, located here in Pasadena. She has directed oversight of research programs, partnering strategies, and regulatory compliance. For 6 decades, HMRI has been making biomedical discoveries, both in diagnostics and therapies, that have set new precedents in medical knowledge and saved lives. HMRI is Pasadena's only dedicated biomedical research organization, and as in the process, as many of us can see when we go over to Huntington Hospital, process of building a state-of-the-art new laboratory on South Fair Oaks in Pasadena. Dr. Chetta grew up in New Jersey, attended Princeton as an undergraduate, and then graduated from medical school at Columbia in New York City. Mid-career as a medical school professor, she returned to school at Caltech, where she focused on stem cell biology and earned a PhD. At Caltech, she received the prestigious Clauser Prize for Best Dissertation. Tonight, Dr. Chetta will focus on a topic that is close to the hearts and minds of all sports participants, parents, and fans, and that's concussions. Specifically, she will discuss new approaches to understanding childhood and adult concussions at HMRI. I bring you Dr. Chetta.
Is my computer under here somewhere? My computer is under here somewhere.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that.
Alrighty.
You don't have to give it to you.
No, we do.
Oh, she has it.
Okay, well, I'll get started before the pictures come up and say thank you very much for having me here. I think you'll understand why I returned to Pasadena to take this job, because I saw diamonds in the rough scattered around Pasadena in our 4 very ancient laboratory buildings, and knew that if we could get the dialogue going between these quite siloed departments, that we would have a great small nonprofit research institute going. And I think we're well on our way. So a little bit about our history. We are not part of Huntington Hospital, but 64 years ago, 2 physician scientists of the hospital set out to set up HMRI, the research institutes. And the first building is one of our 4 buildings that we have in Pasadena on the hospital campus. And let's see. I will also tell you that it's been a real pleasure to have to learn new things. And when you take over an organization that is as scattered as HMRI was in the neurosciences, in cell biology, in cardiovascular disease, liver disease, imaging research, and how do you put this all together? And I think that the story that I'm going to tell you is a lot of the story that I went through in trying to figure out how to make the best traumatic brain injury research program in the country.
It's coming on, sorry about
that. And I'm going to skip over some of the front slides that have pictures of HMRI, and we can come back to them at the end. So when I arrived at HMRI, we were funded by the Army, the U.S. Army, to study mild traumatic brain injury in adults and in civilians. So that's the same as concussion, mild traumatic brain injury. Now, why would the Army fund us to do this? Well, it turns out that despite everything that you hear about all the knowledge in the NFL about head injury leading to dementia, about all of the sports injuries in kids getting press, no one has ever done a natural history of this disease. No one has described in great medical detail what it means to have a concussion, and what happens to you over the month after that. And HMRI happened to have some of really interesting technical equipment that nobody else has. So I'll tell you about putting those technologies together to get a picture of traumatic brain injury. So our protocol, funded by the hospital, funded by the Army, takes people from Huntington Hospital ER who present with a head injury, but they have a negative CT, so there's no bleeding in their head, there's no skull fracture, but they have the symptoms of concussion, so they're a mild traumatic brain injury, and they come over to us and they're studied intensively for 30 days. We do balance and sleep patterns, we interview them, we do blood work to look for disruption of the barrier to the brain. We do electrophysiology, we do all kinds of fancy imaging and spectroscopy, which I'll try to explain to you because it's really exciting. And one of the reasons that the Army decided to have us as the center to do this study was that we also have a very unusual piece of equipment called magnetoencephalography, and I'll explain that to you as well. So the idea was we take all of these tests a day or so after the person is concussed, and then we follow them with a series of these same tests for 30 days. And the challenge the Army gave us was, get us a biomarker, get us something quantitative and sure that tells whether someone has had a concussion or not, because right now we don't have that. So HMRI has a fantastic long history in developing new technologies around magnetic resonance imaging. And it turns out I had to learn a lot about MRI because I'm an anesthesiologist and intensive care doctor. I knew diddly-do about MRI. And if you want to run a program like this, you have to start learning. So this is a picture of the magnetoencephalography unit in which patients slip into this, and then the headpiece is lowered over them, and then we close them into a magnetically shielded room. So what you get from the MEG is the magnetic signals of the brain that you then superimpose mathematically on the MRI signals to get a sense of particular patterns of electrical waves in a particular part of the brain. And we started to see some very interesting things using this fancy piece of equipment. Now, if you look over here, I'll use my pointer. Does that work? Yeah. I mean, someone can certainly tell that this patient looks different than this. These are heat maps that are mathematical transformations of the strengths of certain kinds of waves in the brain. And what we found was that, the patients who had concussions, and we had control patients that I'll tell you about, but the patients who had concussions developed this slow EEG pattern in their frontal lobes. And this is where you make your executive decisions. And it goes so well with the symptoms that these people describe to you. They're in a fog. They can't decide about money. They can't decide about when to go to bed. They can't decide what to do. So we thought that we might have that magical quantitative biomarker of concussion that no one else has had. And I'll come back to that in a minute. We also do some very fancy diffusion tensor imaging in which you can actually see stretch of the long fibers of the nerves. This hasn't been so informative for us. But we were left with this emerging delta slow wave activity. But the problem was that when we studied the patients at 30 days, that didn't go away, even though most of the patients were feeling pretty better by that point. So have we found a biomarker for concussion that will eventually go away? Or are people, adults in this case, stuck with this electrical abnormality even after one mild traumatic brain injury? Patients are really intensively studied, and a lot of them become incredibly loyal to us as well. So as I saw these abnormalities developing in our studies of adult patients, I thought, boy, we should look at the kids. And we made an arrangement with Pasadena Unified School District to start studying the children in the sports, and we had no funding for this. So then along came the Lucas Brothers Foundation. John and Genevieve are here tonight, who have kept us going in this program, and they allowed us to take some real risks in our research based on our strengths that I think are really going to pay off in the long term for how we understand this injury even more deeply. So the numbers for pediatric concussion are really quite stunning. 5% of visits to the ERs are for this injury. Most traumatic brain injury is mild, so this is the vast majority of pediatric brain injury. It's the leading cause of death up to age 44, and the highest incidence is in the youngest children. So it's a very complicated disease. So not only do you have mechanical damage, but you set off what we call excitotoxic signaling, things that in the extreme could cause epileptic seizures. There's a lot of oxidative stress, all kinds of metabolic changes, inflammation, even with the mildest of injuries. How do we query that? So when we presented our numbers down at Fort Detrick to the Army last July, I was really quite amazed that the soldiers don't sustain their injuries quantitatively as much in the battlefield. They sustain their injuries at play. And it's really important to know that, because it turns out that young soldiers' brains are still developing. They're a lot like pediatric patients. And the important lesson for kids is that mild repeat injury is synergistic in terms of damage. So if you're not fully recovered before you return, you will, and you get injured, and you're more likely to get injured if you don't fully recover before you return. The chances of you sustaining a synergistic injury are really high. The other interesting thing that I just did a big gulp on when I realized is there's only one disease that I know of, having practiced medicine since the 1970s, that children take longer to recover from than adults, and it's this injury. It's traumatic brain injury. And that's because their brains are still developing. So if an adult has a traumatic brain injury and knocks off a few neurons, a child will do that too. They'll knock off a few neurons. But all of the wiring that's going on, the final setting up of the signaling of the brain that happens until you're in your 20s, also gets disrupted with kids, and that's why they take so much longer to recover. The other thing that was so striking is that when you look through the literature, the databases, the quantitative databases on kids are just terrible. They're scant. And here we were at HMRI sitting on the largest MR spectroscopy database in children in the world. So it's important to understand, I think, why we were all inspired to take what we were learning in adults and put it back into kids. We have just such fundamental questions about this disease. When do you put a kid back to play? Do we ever recover? We may find that out this year. And again, TBI is the only disorder where kids take longer to recover. And I think that that's an important thing for teachers and coaches when they're deciding how to push kids back into their schoolwork, let alone into play. So what do we do now to diagnose? Not everybody has a magnetoencephalography. In fact, as I said, we're the only ones in Los Angeles County. We have really poor tools. So kids are particularly hard if they're not verbal to diagnose. We start with something called the Glasgow Coma Scale. Anyone who's worked in an ER has to learn the Glasgow Coma Scale. It's really crude. If you respond to speech by opening your eyes, you get 7 points. The highest is 15. So we make a diagnosis based on history, and often these are not witnessed. We'll say that there was loss of consciousness for less than 30 minutes. amnesia lasting less than a day, any period of confusion or disorientation, and the more serious signs are unusual in mild traumatic brain injury, but we again use this Glasgow Coma Scale. Again, it's really important to talk to people. If you just make a cursory examination of someone who's come in with an injury, you won't get it at all. So we learned this really quickly from our control patients. So our control patients were adults from 18 to 44 who came into the ER with a peripheral injury, so a leg injury, something like that, where they hadn't hit their head. But we were sitting there talking to one of the controls, who was a Marine from Camp Pendleton who got into a mild car accident up here in Pasadena. And he just clearly was acting like a concussed patient. And when you talk to him about his accident in detail, you realize he was whiplashed. And you have fluid around your brain, so that fluid is kind of buffering you from your skull. But when your body goes in one direction and your head goes in the other direction, your head goes back and forth in that puddle. And so it's not surprising that we were seeing also this frontal lobe injury, electrical injury, because no matter where you get hit, your head is going to have a frontal lobe. It's huge. So we decided to really throw our technologies at this problem. And our young MD PhD from China, Zhanghong Arakaki, has really taught herself to be a great electrician. These are really hard to interpret, so just try to stick with me here. So one of the tests, for example, is a color word interference test. The computer screen will show the word green, and if it's in green, in the color green, you press 1. The computer screen will show the word green, and if it's in a different color, you press 2. Pretty simple test. And I was kind of thinking, oh, this is not going to show anything. Maybe the concussed patients will be a little slower in responding, and their electrical signals will be a little slower than our control patients. But what she found was really very compelling. Basically, the concussed patients did not answer as well on that first day after injury. They weren't as accurate. They were equally quick in their answers, and they mostly recovered in terms of the answers by 30 days. But in that initial period, the control patients would light up the particular parts of their brain that they were using to accomplish the task. But the concussed patients would light up their entire brains. Their brains had to put so much more energy to work around that acute injury. And any child can tell the difference between this scan and this scan. Really quite remarkable. So this, she also did another different kind of electrophysiologic simple cognitive test. This time you have to press a 1 when the number that appears on the screen was presented to you 2 numbers ago. And the same story happened. Any child could tell the difference between this lit up everywhere across the brain, across all those electrodes, and this. So we have probably a pretty good quantitative test that not only can find the TBI and is quick and easy to do, it's not invasive, you don't have to get into any sort of fancy scanner. And it may be something that's even more valuable because it will allow us to follow recovery and maybe allow us to follow interventions and how people respond to them. So we're a journey to understand these signals even better, and we're now collaborating with other math groups who have other ideas about how we can get even more information from these signals. So the other technology that we decided to throw at this is, again, something I'm really excited about. So HMRI had what I told you is the largest pediatric database of MR spectroscopy. So magnetic resonance spectroscopy was really discovered at HMRI, and it grew out of Caltech's nuclear magnetic resonance program. Jack Roberts, who recently passed away, one of the great chemists of all time, was chairman of our board in the old days, and he worked with our imaging group and basically took NMR from a laboratory technique to a clinical technique. And so now, without any radiation, without radionuclides, you can use our MRI scanner. And this is the kind of information we get back as clinicians. We get peaks that tell us about the abundance of certain chemicals in the brain. This is chemical imaging of the brain. So you have anatomic imaging that you can do with MRI, but we can also look at chemicals. And what we had up until last year was basically a dozen or so chemicals that we could look at. And this one, N-acetyl aspartate, tells you about the abundance of nerve cells, and in Alzheimer's disease, for example, it goes down as neurodegeneration happens. This one over here, myoinositol, goes up when you have inflammatory processes in the brain. The most common use for spectroscopy in medicine is for this guy right here, choline. If a neurosurgeon sees a spot on the brain, a lesion on the brain on MRI, we're the only people who do spectroscopy around here. We'll get patients from City of Hope all over the place sent in, and we'll look for this choline peak here. If the choline peak is really high, that spot is most likely a tumor. If it's not, it's most likely infection. So I'm looking at this, and we have this rich database, and I see this highly filtered spectrum that doesn't give us a whole lot of chemical information. It gives us some, but I know somehow deep in my heart that if we went back to the raw data that's coming out of the MRI machine, that we could potentially learn a whole lot more about the chemical changes in the brain. And that's how we used the Lucas Brothers Foundation money. So we took the raw data coming out of the machine and sent it to a math group that had worked on NMR, so the lab origins of spectroscopy. They happened to be inside the FDA in the National Toxicology Research Labs outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. And we sent them the raw data. And instead of these 12 peaks, we can now identify 94 chemicals in the brain. And guess what? When we sent them the pediatric brain injury kids, the mild traumatic brain injury kids data, versus our controls, these peaks, these chemicals separate out really quite beautifully. So this is it's a three-dimensional display, but now we have the opportunity to, along with the electrical signals that I showed you, potentially follow changes over the course of a month and potentially follow changes with the course of interventions that are tried for these kids. And again, no radiation. MRI has no safety signals. You could repeat this as often as you want over the course of the kid's recovery. So we're really, really excited about that. So let's go on a little bit to the more severely concussed kids, the ones who don't recover. And again, I think these tools are going to be very important for understanding the biology of this disease. So you can't really predict which kids are going to not recover in the course of 3 months, and that's the timeline definition for diagnosis of a chronic post-concussion syndrome. And these kids are not normal. I gave a talk over at the Mayfield High School to the girls, and every girl in the school was in there. They've had a lot of problems with concussions there this year. And one little girl raised her hand and said, "I had a concussion a year ago, I'm not better, why?" And she wasn't better. And my answer wasn't probably very good, but I said, unlike rats and mice, we bring our genetic diversity to this. We also are very limited in medicine in saying how severe this pretty heterogeneous concussion syndrome is. That's why I'm really hoping that with this chemical and electrical information, we can really subgroup patients and maybe predict those which are going to go on to a post-concussion syndrome. But this is a real problem, even again, if you think you've only had a mild injury. And this is from a review article of all of the resources that get thrown at these kids. They certainly need psychological assistance because it's very frustrating not to be able to think for 3 months. But I think this is a marker that we really just don't know what to do with these kids. In a lot of ways, it's easier to treat someone who had a severe brain injury. We can get in there and, evacuate the blood from the brain and all of that thing. So these mild injuries are much more frustrating. So what's really, I think, the important message of studying mild traumatic brain injury is that this is not something in isolation. We think that learning about the chemistry and electrophysiology and anatomy of mild traumatic brain injury is really going to help us understand Alzheimer's disease in the long run. And I'll just say a little bit about the fact that we have a fantastic clinical Alzheimer's study where these kinds of tools are also being brought to bear on patients who are elderly and start out normal at age 70 or above. We're now taking people above 60, if anybody wants to volunteer. And following them, look at the shrinkage of the brain in these patients. Now, everyone always asks us, what is the relationship of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the thing that the professional football players get, this early dementia that looks a lot like Alzheimer's? Well, biochemically, they're very different diseases. So Alzheimer's disease is very much driven by a protein called A-beta, which is this. The other reason I think that these tools are incredibly important is that post-traumatic headache is a huge problem. And most post-traumatic headache is migraine-like in its appearance. And this is the major complaint of returning soldiers, this post-traumatic headache issue. Of the concussion, perhaps we can intervene to prevent this kind of problem. And we have about $30 million worth of grants pending with the Department of Defense right now because we have a research plan that takes us from traumatic brain injury to Alzheimer's, and a research plan that I think will take us from traumatic brain injury. The slideshow is stuck. So I don't know why, but I'll tell you that what the next slide was a summary. So the real strength of Huntington Medical Research Institutes is that our labs are, by design, in our new strategic plan, run by physicians who have incredible clinical experience. I graduated from medical school in 1979. I've been a doctor for a long time. I was a med school professor for 27 years, and the other people who are running labs are just like me at HMRI. They have deep clinical experience, and they're really good scientists. They're better scientists than I am. But it's when we come together with our very different backgrounds, cardiologist talking to a neurologist, talking to an anesthesiologist, talking to a hepatologist, that our insights have really come together. And so just in this example of the study of traumatic brain injury, we had the imaging people, we had the neurologists, we had the protein biochemists, the lipid biochemists are in there. I even have a fluid dynamics postdoc working on blood flow issues, and our MRI guy is developing new tools on how to look at the vascular function after brain injury. All these things will be important for understanding the other neurologic diseases that are common. So I'll stop there, even though I don't get to go show you my fancy ending slide, and take questions. And also just put in a plug for HMRI. We are in the process of putting up really fantastic laboratories that our scientists deserve to work in. And our plan, as you look at the building, you'll get a sense of it now. On the first floor, we will have what I am calling for now a clinical research medical practice, where the technologies that we are developing for diagnosis and therapy will be tested in the context of a real medical practice, and we want to put technologies in there that no one else has anywhere. And some of it will be these spectroscopy studies, some of it will be these EEG studies, and I really see past that we can use the EEG, for example, not only to diagnose a disease, but we can use EEG feedback to train people out of their disease. That's the real audacious goal for HMRI. The second and third floors will, of course, be our more traditional wet labs. And the first floor will also contain a really nice auditorium where we can offer our public lectures, and that will be the very public space. Right now we have a terrible auditorium, and I hope that all of you will take advantage of getting on our seminar list so that you can come and hear not only about our work, but hear our guest speakers, because this is a place that's going to make a difference. Thank you. Wait a second. It moved. So let me just show you some of the players here. This is the neurosciences group. We're small. We have 55 employees. Mike Harrington is lead. He's a neurologist from Scotland. Zhang Hong Arakaki is the woman who developed all these fantastic EEG tools. Alfred Fonte is our lipid biochemist who's pulling out new lipids from the spinal fluid of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And Noah and Katie both work on migraine. They're young PhD scientists. It's a fantastic group, but they deserve their acknowledgement. And we thank the Army and, of course, the Lucas Brothers Foundation.
We still have some time.
Yep.
Do anybody have some questions that they'd like to pose? You over there?
You implied that a severe case, a severe head trauma, that you would have blood. Have you studied the brains of the severe head trauma to see if there are changes?
No, but we will. So I have an appointment over in USC's anesthesiology department. As you know, LA County USC is a big trauma center. And it was really kind of striking to me that the surgeons were doing nice academic work in the trauma center, but the anesthesiologists weren't. And they have a fantastic trauma anesthesia team. So we have joined forces and are writing grants together so that we can study their more severe injury with the tools that we have at HMRI.
Very good. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, what cooperation do you have between your group and other groups working on Alzheimer's disease? Do you exchange information? Is this a would you repeat the question?
So what collaborations and interactions do we have with other groups in Alzheimer's disease? Well, I'll tell you something that really makes me proud about HMRI. So since 2011, we've recruited 150 patients into our Alzheimer's study. Patients have to come in with normal memory and normal cognition. The idea is we wanted to find predictors of who was going to get sick and who wasn't, and we have, and that's another complicated talk. Because we're small, we really do take incredible care of these patients. So we do more testing than the National Institute of Health funded big academic Alzheimer's disease research centers. There's one of those at USC. And they would not get funded if they didn't use our data. If patients have difficulty getting to us, we'll go out and pick them up. Even though we're doing many, many more tests, including a yearly spinal tap on them, the USC doesn't do that. They stick with us. And we have a freezer full of brains from people who left their brains to us because they so believed in our research. So yes, we have a collaboration with USC, but I think little HMRI is giving them a whole lot more than we're getting back. So we get access to some of their biochemistry facilities and things like that. And we have joint conferences on Saturdays.
Question?
Yes.
This is a two-parter. One, I'm the speech language pathologist at our middle school here in San Marino. And I'm wondering if you think it might be a good idea if Huntington and Arcadia met, would give me a bell if they got one of my little angels in their emergency room, so I could let their teachers know that they might be a little different for 30 or 60 days or maybe a year. So what do you think about maybe me reaching out to the hospitals and having that dialogue so that our kids are better prepared and their teachers are better prepared? Because a lot of times they will fall off bikes and end up over here, but we don't know about it. There's never a phone call to me or an email to me. That's my first question. What do you think?
Well, I think that a neuropsychologist is the best place to send a kid, and there are a couple who work with us who are absolutely superb. Getting the kid to any health professional is probably fine, but I would really encourage you, parents, grandparents, building the database on kids for this kind of research is critical. Send them to us. They'll get free MRIs. We won't do a spinal tap. They'll get free EEGs. They'll learn a lot about themselves. And we really, really do want to see them, especially after they've been concussed, but all comers. I think that each school system has to think about a process for how they refer kids. I'm working with the Mayfield school system now. They have a TBI task force because they've had a number of kids. And it shouldn't be one person. It should really be a multidisciplinary team that makes up the protocol. And so there are lots of options for kids to call when they think they have a problem.
The second part was, I hear what you're saying about sports. I'd like your opinion about something else that's optional in life, and that's roller coasters.
When I go on them, I throw up. So I haven't been on it in a long time. It's definitely possible to get a whiplash injury when you're going at the speed of a roller coaster. So, yeah. I mean, I think they have the head pretty much, so you can't go like this too much, but still it's possible. I mean, now we know that there's a lot of head injury in soccer. I'm sure you all know that. And like the NFL, the professional soccer leagues are seeing a huge increase in Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So that's from probably chronic injury to the spinal column. That's a peripheral nerve disease rather than a central nervous system disease. And water polo is coming in statistically as the sport that also has a lot of who knew injury. Yeah.
Question. Can you briefly describe, let me just describe the protocol you hear in high school and colleges? They think they got a concussion, and someone looks at them at the sidelines, and then if they determine the person had a concussion, they say, we have to stay out for a week. Based on that, it doesn't seem like they should be ever going back that soon.
Yeah. So our experience is that the vast majority of kids are not better in a day, and that the only way you're going to know if they should return to play or return to school is to sit and talk to them and maybe, start having some of these quantitative exams. You cannot predict when someone is going to get better. If you say a week to everybody, you're going to hurt some people. That's just the way it is. Yeah.
If I can clarify that a little, the protocol is not you have to stay out at least a week. The protocol is it's a minimum of a week. And there's even recommendations that coaches should go talk to the classroom teachers. Is the kid able to function in class the way they should? So it's a more involved protocol.
Yeah. No, I don't think he was implying that you did that. So the coach back there said that the protocol for San Marino is more nuanced.
It's actually CIF.
CIF. It's more nuanced and.
On a tent, or they go back and, are they getting tests that would lead?
Yeah, so I mean, the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics has come back with some tests that are good, that help make the diagnosis. I think they probably missed some. Again, it's not everybody acts the same way after the same injury. And there's a lot of companies making eye-tracking devices that are sort of quantitative. So we're working with one that spun out of USC Engineering. That's all fine. And I think, they should be interviewing the kids on the sideline and pull them out of the game. It's the follow-up that's really the problem. And, the neurologists go like this in terms of their ideas of what should be done. Right now, rest is considered a really important thing. Rest meaning no reading, really no computers, just taking the energy level of the brain down. At least that's what the pediatric neurologists who really are concentrating on this are saying right now. That could change too. And the problem is, we haven't had tools to, short of interview, really determine whether a kid is better or not. And that's where I think that the development of these tools is really going to make a difference. Yes.
The research at MRI ever extend to neurological problems such as MS and PD?
We don't have a Parkinson's program right now. We work with a really great MS specialist in the community. He sends us, we're developing some new imaging tools around multiple sclerosis. Our programs, we have the traumatic brain injury program and an Alzheimer's program, and we also have a large program in migraine. And I didn't know this until I was at HMRI. Migraine is the most common neurologic disease, and there are almost 33 million migraineurs in the United States. So, interestingly, in our neuroscience research group, 4 of our scientists are migraineurs. And so they're quite passionate about this research, as you can imagine. Again, we're small, we can't do everything. But those are the real strengths, and that covers common diseases, and we are purposefully working on common diseases. Anybody else? Thank you, great questions.
We have a token of our appreciation for your coming and speaking to us, and we all very much appreciate it. And best of luck in the future. Just a reminder, next month, we're going to have Bill Davis, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Southern California Public Radio, and he'll come and talk to us about the relevancy of public radio in today's changing communications. So please sign up early and often. So I think it'll be a great presentation. And thank you.
All set?
All set? Sign the die.